the first overview video of the topic for the Asia topic. We're looking at in depth 2 wars, Korea and Vietnam. So Korea is our first war we're going to look at in 1950 to 53 and Vietnam 1954-75-ish. And they're sort of these proxy wars in the background of this Cold War. So the first thing we need to do is really understand the key language. So we've got a Cold War, that's a war in which there's no direct fighting. We have a civil war, which is a war between or within the same country. And then a proxy war, which both Korea and Vietnam are. And proxy wars are when major powers support a smaller power to benefit the major power. I've got a beautiful drawing to represent this. So in the Cold War, our 2 main people are the USA and the USSR. They're the 2 people that are fighting the Cold War, the 2 superpowers. They don't want to fight each other because they're both going to end up having nuclear weapons, and that's really dangerous. So they get involved in these civil wars. The civil war is where there's 2 different sides in the same country fighting. Now, in both Korea and Vietnam, if they'd been left alone, their civil war would have been over quite quickly, but most likely the communists would have won, which is why America gets involved. The way they get involved and turn this internal conflict between one country into a much bigger crisis and part of the Cold War and part of a proxy war is by sending in either weapons, America sends in troops, advice or money. So they get involved, they're trying to back their side. So the Americans often are supporting the South in both our wars, and the USSR, the Russians, are supporting the North. The Russians send in a lot of weapons, some money and also advice, but we don't really see troops on the ground for the Russians because if the Americans are in there with troops, the Russians don't want to go in there with troops because they're worried about escalating it into a nuclear war. There is no point being in charge of a world if you've blown it up. So again, those words. Cold War, no direct fighting. We don't see them both in the same war. Okay, we kind of see it a little bit sneakily in Korea, but for the most part, they're not facing each other on the battlefield. A civil war is a war between 2 sides of the same country, and a proxy war is when they get involved by sending in things, so they make it much bigger and much longer. So our Cold War is between the USA and the USSR, and they are our 2 superpowers. Our civil wars, we've got North v South Korea, so the North and South Korea fighting, and a civil war in Vietnam, and it's in South Vietnam, and it is a guy called Diem versus the Viet Cong. Our proxy wars are both Korea and Vietnam. Now, if we run across to the other side to explain, well, what is this Cold War? There's no direct fighting, but what is it there that they're arguing about? So they're arguing over their ideologies. And an ideology is just a political idea or ideal. The 2 ideologies of the Cold War is capitalism and communism. So if we start with capitalism first, so this is going to be our American side. Capitalism is an idea that individuals have quite a lot of freedom. So if you want to make a lot of yourself or make money, you can make money and that's yours. That's an ability that you can do in a capitalist society. So if you open up a business and make a load of money, yes, you have to give some taxes, different degrees, but that's your money. And if you're poor, you're poor. You should just get on with it yourself. That's like on you. So it seems quite unfair in that when it comes to money. However, capitalist countries are usually very democratic, which means you get to vote and you get freedom of speech. So with democratic, let me just put another bit in. With it being democratic, it means your government needs support of the people. So the government will need the support of the people. So they need to vote on you. So they're either going to try and persuade you to agree with them that their side is right, or we see, particularly in Vietnam, they're just going to try and keep things hidden, which is going to make people cross. The other thing about a democratic society with freedom of speech is that the public can criticise the government. So we see lots of anti-war comments, anti-war criticism happening. On the other side, so the capitalists are going to be against the communists. So communism is, again, a political ideology, and it's to do with money. So in communist countries, what they want to do is share all the wealth out equally between everyone. The government's going to make sure people all have everything the same, which sounds like a lovely idea, especially if you're a poor country and there's some really rich people in there and you're poor. But in practice, it hasn't really worked out that well. And most of the time, because it is then run by a dictator or dictatorship, like we saw with Hitler's Germany. In a dictatorship, there is no freedom of speech. People do what they are told to, or, you're arrested, murdered. You cannot be critical of a government of communism. So this cannot be critical, or whether you can be critical, is going to be important in answering our source questions for this topic, just to make it a little bit easier, keep that in mind. Okay, so we've got these two political ideals. They're fighting over capitalism and communism, which is an idea. So it's not necessarily land. They're not trying to take each other's land, but they are trying to, or both of these political ideas, will only work if they've got people either to trade with or take. So communism needs to share out resources equally, but they need some more resources that they might not have in their country. And capitalism relies quite heavily on trade, so they need people to be able to buy it. This all comes down to maybe what the background of the Cold War is. And that is, at the end of World War II, there were two really strong powers left: the USA and her allies, and the USSR and their allies. During World War II, we're going to pretend that this is a real world and this is Europe. During World War II, if we remember, Hitler had invaded Russia in 1941. And Russia had asked, because he was supposed to sort of be on the side of the Allies, and had asked for aid, for help. And it wasn't until 1945 that the Allies were, 1944, that the Allies were ready to go in. So while Stalin was fighting the Nazis, or the Russians were fighting the Nazis, every time they sort of freed a bit of land, whether it was Russian before or not, they just kind of stayed there. Just sort of took it over, either with the military or by replacing the government and putting in a government that followed communism and wanted to be allied with the USSR. This is known as the salami tactic, so just taking off a slice a little bit at a time. So it's not really an invasion of a country. It's sort of just yay, we freed you from the Nazis and now we're just going to stay. Or sometimes it's referred to as Stalinization. But in the communist country and under the dictatorship of Stalin, we get this Iron Curtain. It's not a real thing, but it's this idea that behind this Iron Curtain, there's no freedom of speech, there's no sort of interaction, so it's sort of impenetrable. So these two are going to fight about who's going to essentially rule the world. And they're going to use the ideology as their basis, and they're going to use proxy wars to fight it. So again, we need to look a little bit more as into why. Well, towards the end of the war, Truman and Stalin were supposed to be working together, but Truman really didn't like the Russians. They had both been in competition to see who could build the first nuclear bomb. America does it first. They dropped two bombs on Japan in August 1945, signalling to Stalin that they had that power. So it helped them end the war with Japan, but also went, haha, we've got it. However, Stalin eventually gets his own nuclear weapons in 1949. The first bomb he's got is called Lightning. This then means there's a bit of more of a race between who can build more bombs, better bombs that can fire from different continents, bombs that you can fire from space. This build-up of arms gets us to a position which we call as the MAD theory. So mutually assured destruction. So mutually, both countries, both sides, assured for definite, and destruction, suggesting the destruction of the world. So it's then sort of decided that we're not actually ever going to press the big red button to set them off, because we want to be in charge of the world and we need the world to be around. The biggest test of this theory was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. That's quite sort of in the background. So in public, they're supposed to be getting along or trying to get along for most of the time. And then in the background, there's a lot of hatred. We also have quite a public, this is the arms race. So about who's going to have the best weapons, but we also have a space race, and it's linked in quite a lot to the arms race because a lot of the technology needed to get somebody into space is the same sort of technology to fire a bomb from wherever you are. Russia starts winning the space race, which makes America even more concerned to make sure that they're not beaten, like in the proxy wars, because they're the first people to send a space shuttle up into orbit, somebody around the Earth and back down safely. But eventually America wins in 1969 with the first man on the moon. I've missed a bit, let me go back. At the end of the Second World War then, while Stalin was taking over slices, Truman had been really worried about this Iron Curtain and about the spread of communism. So he comes up with this idea of the Truman Doctrine, which is essentially that the world needs to pick a side. Just going to pause. That the world needs to pick a side. He says this in 1947, and he's also going to try and stop communism spreading. The first way they're going to try is the Marshall Plan. So a guy called Marshall went round, and in 1948, they established this plan, which is countries that are close to becoming communist are often very poor countries with some rich leaders. And we can understand why if we remember them wanting to share out the wealth. So he suggested that that the Americans could help countries that are at risk of communism to stop this communism spreading by giving financial aid, advice, and then later they're going to do some military aid. Underlying all of this fear, this competition, remember in the capitalist countries, they need to sort of have the public on side. And this goes a bit haywire in the 1950s. So we have something called the Red Scare. There had been which is basically they're scared of communists. So in the interwar period, so 1919 to 39-41, 1919-ish, after World War I, in America, there was a big fear of communists because the Russians had just had their revolution, they've overthrown people, and they were worried about communism coming. We see it again a couple of generations later with McCarthy in the 1950s. So he was a senator, which is quite a high up political position. He found it beneficial to lie about people. So he would say that they were communist spies. He'd get them arrested. He'd get them removed. And he was really effective at making everyone scared. One, that there was communists everywhere ready to take over America. So you all had to keep an eye out. And two, there was lots of false accusations. But his fear that he created, even though he got found out to be a liar, sort of like early, maybe 1955, that fear of communists coming to take over, that communists were spying on people, that communists were the biggest threat ever, had built on the interwar communist theory, and it just kept going. So for the Americans, it was quite important to keep building on this being scared of communists because it built up support for their interventions in both Korea and Vietnam based on Vietnam based on this idea of containing communism. So, quick recap. The Cold War is just this massive period of time from basically 1945-ish all the way up to 1999. I am aware that I haven't said that first, but that's where it is. It's a really long period of time. And it involves basically this big competition between America and the USSR over who could rule the world, influence people. And they're going to both try to stop the other one from getting more influence and to spread their own influence, because that will give them a better position in the world, that will make them stronger, that could potentially make their ideology work better and make them richer. Cold War.